Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome, everyone, depending on where you are in the world, to today's State and Local Government Compliance webinar. Before we get started here, and while folks take the next minute or so to join, we're going to have to kick off with the dad joke, which is customary. So who shall we pick on, BB? What do a tick and the Eiffel Tower have in common?
No idea.
They're both parasites. Ah, all right. That's a good one. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today to talk with us. Today, we're going to talk about Microsoft Purview, the end-to-end story for governing your data estate. I am Adam Blasi, a digital security specialist, and our presenters today will be Bhavana Batia, or as we know her, BB, a senior compliance technical specialist, as well as Bret Hackford, the senior cloud solution architect. He's focused on the Azure data platform. There will also be some other teammates joining us in the Q&A. If you have questions, please navigate to that Q&A button. Feel free to drop them in and we will get to them throughout the presentation. Thank you all again so much for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to you, BB.
Thanks, Adam. So hi, everybody, and today we will be talking about this end-to-end story for governing your data estate using Microsoft Purview. Data has become the most strategic asset for state and local governments. And if data is used effectively, it can simplify the delivery of public services, it can reduce fraud and human error, and it can also increase operational efficiencies. But in reality, state and local government customers are facing several challenges when it comes to data management. Firstly, government data is growing at an unprecedented rate. Many customers tell us that their data is dark. That means they are not aware of what type of data exists and where it exists. Also, government agencies must manage data in compliance to different regulations like HIPAA, CGIS, IRS, various privacy laws, and also NIST framework. And they find it challenging to demystify these regulations and keep updated with constant regulatory changes. Data security is another major challenge because there is sensitive information across the digital landscape. So for example, EPHI or PII information is in users' emails or attachments. There could be credit card numbers or social security numbers on users' Teams chats. Critical infrastructure or public safety related documents may reside on SharePoint sites or your users' OneDrive for Business or even on your on-prem file shares. You may also have custom applications that store sensitive data in databases. There could be HR systems that have your employee information. And on top of all this, there could also be risk of users exfiltrating sensitive content via USBs or printing or copying sensitive content to their personal cloud. So how can Microsoft help with these challenges? Microsoft provides Microsoft Purview, which is a comprehensive set of solutions to help you govern, protect, and manage your data across your multi-cloud, multi-platform data environments, while also meeting the compliance requirements. Microsoft's approach is to help you first discover and understand your data assets so that you can accelerate data value. You can then govern and protect that data across clouds, apps, and devices. You can also identify different types of risks like insider risks, compliance and privacy risks, and you can mitigate those risks through automation. Microsoft Purview consists of risk and compliance solutions and unified data governance solution. The Purview Risk and Compliance Suite provides solutions for data classification, for data protection, data lifecycle management, risk management, and we also have solutions to efficiently discover your data. These solutions are primarily applicable to Microsoft 365 data, but you can also extend it to non-Microsoft 365 data using data connectors. And these solutions can be used by your security team, your risk team, your compliance team, legal teams, and these solutions are available in the Purview Compliance Portal. On the right-hand side of the screen is the Purview Unified Data Governance Suite in the Azure portal, and it has features like Data Map, Data Catalog, and Insights, which are useful for your data consumers, data engineers, or data officers. And this is how we can extend data governance beyond Microsoft 365 to your on-prem data or your multi-cloud and SaaS data. So today I will be covering this risk and compliance management aspect of Purview, and Bret will cover the unified data governance side of Purview. With Microsoft Purview Compliance Portal, you can perform your data classification, your data protection, data lifecycle management, compliance and risk management through a single pane of glass. So the first step towards data governance here is to identify what type of content exists in your environment and where that content exists. So this data classification dashboard here shows you your distribution of different sensitive content within the organization. So example, we provide more than 300 out-of-the-box sensitive information types that will help you detect sensitive content like credit card numbers, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, and much more. You can also see where this sensitive information exists in Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams. And soon we will also launch named entities for identifying medical terms or physical addresses in your government community cloud tenants. We also provide more than 60 AI-based trainable classifiers that will help you automatically identify the type of content, like, for example, financial content or health-related documents or legal agreements, resumes, source code, and much more. Once you know what type of sensitive data exists, you can use sensitivity labels from our information protection framework to automatically protect your files, your emails, meetings, your SharePoint sites, Microsoft 365 group sites, Teams, and you can also extend protection to your non-Microsoft 365 data assets like SQL, Azure SQL, Synapse, Azure Cosmos, and so on. Bret will be later on showing you how information protection can be extended to your schematized data asset. Then data loss prevention can prevent accidental or intentional loss of sensitive data outside your organization. You can get started right away with out-of-the-box compliance templates like HIPAA template, then US privacy law templates. And these will already include the specific types of sensitive information that you want to protect. Data loss prevention policies can also be applied to different locations like your Microsoft 365 services, your endpoint devices, your third-party SaaS apps, and also content on your on-prem file shares. With insider risk management, you can correlate telemetry from different locations, apps, and devices, and you can identify the users who are performing risky sequence of activities based on context like their employee termination date. And with an integrated workflow, you can also collaborate with your HR teams or legal teams who can then mitigate these risks by taking actions. You can also automate your data lifecycle management by retaining the content that you need and dispose the content that you don't need. We also provide an in-place or native records management solution that helps you digitize your file plan and automate your retention schedule. Then there's also e-discovery and audit solutions that will help you efficiently discover data and respond to public records requests or legal requests, and you can perform forensic investigation as well. You can also automate compliance management using Compliance Manager, and this provides you your compliance score for more than 600 regulations like HIPAA, CGIS, NIST 853, and much more. And it also gives you step-by-step improvement actions to manage compliance across multi-cloud environments. Also, our information protection, data loss prevention, and insider risk management solutions can be integrated with each other so that you can fortify your data security and provide defense in-depth approach across your data. That was a high-level overview of our risk and compliance solutions in Purview Compliance Portal. Often our customers want to know how Purview features extend to non-Microsoft 365 data that is there in their database or multi-cloud or SaaS data. So now Bret will be talking about the unified data governance side of Purview. So over to you, Bret.
Awesome. Thanks, Bibi. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. I'm going to try and share out my screen here. There we go. Okay, so I am going to attempt to give a whirlwind tour of the Purview data governance portal. We probably won't have time to go through all the features. This is a product now that's got quite a few of them added to it. But my goal is to kind of hit the main components. And as I do this, you know, obviously you're going to have a lot of questions generated by this demonstration I'm about to give. I do have a couple of my peers in chat that can help out with those questions as I go through. So thank you, Ray and Julian and Priya, for joining us. All right, so first off, what is the Purview Governance Portal and who's it for? So just to give a little background context, in Azure, we had a service called Azure Data Catalog, right? Azure Data Catalog existed several years ago, but they decided they wanted to create sort of a better version of it. So Purview was born. Purview is kind of for business analysts and data engineers and chief data officers to kind of get a top-down bird's eye view of the data estate. And I'm going to go through that with you now. Hopefully this demo actually works out. Now, before I get into the actual demo, just a quick slide on the certifications and the Gov availability. So these are the current certifications for the Azure commercial version of Purview. And while it's not available just yet, it is coming to Azure Government very soon, although we don't have a hard date on that. One last thing is, how does this relate to the compliance portal that BB went through? Because these two are already integrated and that integration is kind of growing. So currently the way it works is that the sensitivity labels that BB talked about from the compliance portal can actually be used by the governance portal in your own data estate in Azure. So as you scan your data sources and add them to the data map, which I'll show here in a bit, that scanning process will automatically apply sensitivity labels from the compliance portal into your own data estate that then will actually flow down through your data sources downstream into all sources that might use that data. For example, if I tag an Azure SQL database column with a sensitivity label, and then later on a report writer, adds that column into a Power BI report, automatically the goal is that that sensitivity label will follow the data into the Power BI data set, and so that any reports that I generate off of that data set will also be marked with that same sensitivity label. So this is early days for that functionality. The whole thing isn't there yet from end to end, but the pieces are in place to make that happen. And that is sort of the goal and evolution of the product. That's where we'll get to eventually. All right, so I'm going to jump out of the slides now and try and actually demo this. Hopefully this works. Okay, so now I'm in the Azure portal. I've already opened up the Purview governance portal. So this is what you'll see when you first land here. So the first thing we're going to show you is the data map, right? So this is an interactive sort of GUI-based view on all of the assets in your entire data estate. Now, this is a pretty simple view, but I'm going to bounce between two different purviews just so you can kind of see the scale that it can get to. So here is a larger demo environment. And as you can see, there's quite a few different data sources in here. Now, in this case, they're actually organized through what we call collections, which is this sort of hierarchy that you can create within your data map to organize the different data assets that or data sources that you add into your data map. So as you can see, one way you might want to organize your data estate is by department, right, in your organization. So an interesting thing to note is that these collections are also a security mechanism. So if I drill into this relational sources collection that I have, you can see within here I have different role types that Purview uses to secure the assets that are scanned into this particular collection. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when I talk about security in this context, I'm not talking about actual security or permissions to the data source itself. So what Purview does is it actually goes out and you connect it to your data sources, which I'll show here in a second. You run scans on those data sources, and then the metadata from the data sources is ingested into the data map. So at no point is it actually storing inside the governance portal the actual data, for example, stored in your Azure SQL database or your data lake in Azure. It's simply scanning things like the names of tables, views, potentially stored procedures, grabbing the metadata around the schema, so it'll get all the column names if it's a relational data source. It'll grab the data types, those sorts of things. But none of the actual data is being ingested into the service itself, and that's an important point to note. So when people come in to use the data map and eventually to use the data catalog to sort of search over the data map, what they're going to be able to see in their search results is going to be based off the permissions they have at any given collection in the data map itself, right? And so that's where these role assignments come into play. So, if I were a user that only had access to, let's say, reader access to this Azure collection, and I did a search, I wouldn't be able to see any files that might be scanned from the data lake over here, right? So that's kind of how you can separate out permissions like that. Okay, so let's go through the classification rules real quick. So when I run a scan, actually, you know what, let's go ahead and let me show you how to add a data source first. So the process goes like this. I pick a collection that I want to register the data source to, click Register Asset, and then you can see the list of currently supported data sources in the governance portal. So one thing to keep in mind is that when I first started demoing this service, there was probably only 5 or 6 different supported data sources, and they were all sort of first-party Azure things. And over the last year or so, almost every time I come in here to demo this service now, it seems, there's at least one new service added, right? So this goes back to the amount of engineering resources that Microsoft is throwing into the Purview governance portal. This service has just iterated rapidly from its original incarnation, and its sort of features and capabilities have grown a ton since it first launched, right? So let's go through and pick Azure SQL database just so you can see how this works. Essentially, if it's a resource that's already in Azure, like an Azure SQL database, it'll automatically pull in from your Azure subscription all of the potential Azure SQL databases that you have access to. It allows you to select a collection to add it to, and then you can register it, right? Now, when you register it, it'll show up in your data map, and from this point, you can actually start a scan. Okay, and let's go through what that looks like. So first off, you can pick the database you want to scan, or you can select to scan the entire server. If it's a server level resource like an Azure SQL database or even an on-prem SQL server. And the important point to point out here is that you can choose different ways to connect to that resource. So I'll point out at this stage that if you're familiar with using Azure Synapse or Azure Data Factory, you know there's a concept of a self-hosted integration runtime, and that self-hosted IR can be used to access resources that you might not normally have direct networking line of sight to. So it's helpful to point out here that you can use that exact same self-hosted IR with Purview to access on-prem resources or even resources in a totally different networking environment that you don't have direct access to. And so all those things are supported as well in the governance portal in Purview. All right, so we'll get to lineage later, but for now, I just want to show you what this looks like when I get to the scan step. Now, as you're scanning your environment, you can scope the scan. So that just means you can pick, the tables or views if you just want to scan a specific schema on your database. You can pick that before you start the scan, right? And then you have the option of choosing a scan rule set. Now, I'll go a little bit more into this when I talk about the classification system, but essentially a scan rule set is a collection of rules, classification rules, that we're going to use to try and tag all of the metadata that's in this data source that we're scanning. Okay, so a little more on that later. But as you finish out the setup for the scan, the idea is you can do a one-time scan if you want, or you can set these to be reoccurring. And so the idea would be that you create a scan that reoccurs on some frequency, and then after the initial scan, which will ingest everything into the data map that you originally selected in that scoping section a few steps back, and then the scan will continue to run on some frequency after that and pull in any of the new or changed data. And so this is the system within which Purview keeps the data catalog and data map up to date, right? So you can set this to run more or less frequently, which does have an impact on the cost, but whatever frequency you set it to, that's sort of the update cadence that you'll see changes reflected from those source systems into the data catalog. Okay, so let's bounce over real quick to the classification rules, because this is pretty cool. All right, so these are very, very similar. In fact, most of them are identical to the classification rules that exist in the compliance portal. So everything you're seeing here is sort of an out-of-the-box classification provided by Microsoft to scan and look for these types of data within your own data estate. So they do that through a combination of regular expressions to capture like string patterns. Some of them use Bloom filters, and a couple of them use actually AI-driven models to sort of identify classifications. And so kind of going back a little earlier to what I was saying on one of the slides is that these classifications and the patterns that are used to identify them are also how the sensitivity labels are applied. So those sensitivity labels that you define in the compliance portal, when you set up that process, you say, I'd also like to extend these into the governance portal in Azure. And when you create that connection, then you can say, okay, anything that shows up as a classification of a person's name, for example, I want to be marked with a confidential sensitivity label. So as those scans happen, the classifications get put in place, and then the sensitivity label is automatically applied. So that's kind of the life cycle of how that works. Now, the other thing you can do is you can actually create your own classifications. And so here's one I already set up. So if you have something in your data that doesn't fit into what might be considered a traditional PII or a government sort of data set, you can define your own custom classification rules. You can have a minimum match threshold, and you can put, in this case, I have a regex pattern to find a certain pattern in the string, and then I can tag that as my own classification. And so what happens when that scan is taking place is it's looking at this pattern you've supplied, it's looking at the minimum match threshold you've set, and it's saying, all right, if 60% of the data in this column matches this pattern, then I want you to tag it with this custom classification. Okay, so all of these classification rules and classifications themselves are kind of bundled up into the scan rule sets, which is what we kind of saw earlier when I was setting up the scan for that Azure SQL database. And so these scan rule sets are dependent on the actual data source type that I'm scanning, and they're essentially collections of classifications that I want to scan for, right? And so, of course, I can create my own custom classification, or I'm sorry, scan rule set. And so that way, maybe I don't need to scan for Canadian passport numbers in my own particular data set. And so I can create a scan rule set that just has the stuff that's pertinent to me and what I'm looking for in my own data. Okay, so let's switch over to, I'm going to go through quickly here the business glossary. So within Purview, there is the capability to create a glossary. And the glossary, just what it sounds like, it's the idea where you can create terms that have meaning to your own business or organization. And then as the data assets get scanned and mapped and put into the governance portal, you can then come in, data stewards can come into the Purview portal and they can tag those assets with glossary terms to provide more context and more meaning for people who are actually looking these things up, using the data catalog or using the search engine. So first thing to point out, you can have multiple glossaries. You can separate these out if there's a reason to. And you can have multiple term templates, which I'll kind of explain here in a second. But let's just open up one of these glossary terms so you can get an idea of the type of information that's stored in the term itself. So obviously you can have the name and the definition, and all of these will, once they're tagged into the assets, which we'll see here a little later, will show up, right, as part of the search and part of the overview of the data asset itself. You can define acronyms from this particular screen. I can even see which data assets are already tagged with this glossary term. Okay. I have a related tab here, which if I had anything marked as a synonym, it would show up. There's also a hierarchy system to the glossary to where you can have parent and child relationships between these terms if they're related in that way. And then also you can come in here and mark, experts or data stewards that are the people responsible or someone you could reach out to contact if you had more questions around that actual glossary term itself. All right, so let me bounce back here. So we can see if I click new term, it asks me which template to use, and you can kind of see this is what it looks like when you're adding a new term. So you kind of fill out this information, which is somewhat what we saw on the other screen. And then if there's more information that you'd like to define as part of a particular glossary term, but it's not kind of served by this default interface, that's where the term templates come in. So this is where you can define your own custom term templates to add attributes to the terms that are specific to what you want. So for example, you could create a multiple choice field. You can even provide the options for that field so that when someone's creating a new term, they can choose to use this particular term template. And in addition to the system default fields, they'll also get a little drop-down multiple choice field where they can select one of these three things. So you have a little more control than just what's offered, out of the base system term template there. All right, so let's go and actually look at the data catalog now. All right, so while this is refreshing, I'll load up this one as well so we can bounce to it if need be. Okay, so you can access all of the data map, everything you've scanned, in a couple different ways. You can browse it by collection, so using those logical containers that you created earlier when you were setting up your data map. You can look at it by source type, so based off the specific types of the data sources themselves that you've scanned, they'll show up here. Let me see if I can load up this collection again, refresh it real quick. So unfortunately, this demo environment is going a little slower than normal, but okay, here it goes. So I clicked in just at a top level to look at every sort of asset that's already been scanned in, right? Now you can see there's quite a few that already exist in this particular data map. And then the other thing I want to point out is that throughout the data catalog experience, there's all these filters that'll show up over here on the side, right? So even though there's a ton of information that's scanned into the data map, there's a pretty nice experience in terms of being able to filter, well, actually, I just want to see relational tables, right? And so now you can see that it's just going to show me, here's an Azure SQL table, a Snowflake table, Teradata, Oracle. These are all supported data sources. Or maybe I just want to look at, files, and files might be something that lives in a data lake or a blob storage account. So you can see that show up over here. And there's quite a few different ways to sort of slice and dice this data. You can, of course, filter by classification itself. So if I want to see everything that's been tagged, with a person's name classifier, or even a contact, right? I can filter by contact, sensitivity labels. There's quite a few different ways to filter this data. And while I haven't quite shown it just yet, these filters also show up on the search experience, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill into one of these actual data assets here, so you can get an idea of what happens after we run that scan, after the metadata has been ingested. Like, what does that actually look like in the catalog? Okay, so this particular asset is an Azure SQL table as well. We can see on the overview screen there is a description. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that the idea here is you scan sort of the raw data, and then you have data stewards or curators or owners of these data assets come in and enrich the data catalog, what's been scanned, with more information, right? So in this case, you would add an asset description, and so that when someone went to search for this table or a column in this table, like a data analyst looking to create a report, they would be able to pull up and get all this extra metadata that you and your team have put in, so that they have a lot more context to what's actually in this table, right? So on the overview screen, you can see, first off, the classifications that have been applied at the asset level, so the top level, the SQL table itself. I can also see which of those classifiers were triggered by those, regular expression patterns that we wrote earlier, or just the ones that come out of the box. Which one of those actually hit on the schema, right, of this particular table. On the right over here, you can see there's a bit of a hierarchy, which is nice. It shows you, in this case, that this table is part of this schema in the Azure SQL database, and this database, which is, is hosted on this server. You also get some high-level property information, just like things around create time, modify time. These will differ a little bit based on the data source, but they'll give you some extra information there. And then, of course, the bread and butter here is the actual, you can look at the actual schema, right? So this all came in from that scan. These classifications, like we talked about, were automatically applied. And then based on the classification and its associated sensitivity label, which we've defined in the compliance portal, those sensitivity labels also get applied, okay? You get the data type. Now the asset description is something that you can fill in yourself. And so this is part of the data curation process. So keep in mind, this is the end result, but users would come in here, click this edit button after the scan took place, and help put in the rest of this information, okay? Now, we also have the contacts tab. So again, just like the glossary terms, we can tag the owners, the experts, people who you might want to reach out to if you have more questions about this particular data asset, or even potentially how to get access to it, right? And then on all the data assets, there's also a related tab, which it sort of changes depending on the data source, but in this case, it'll show you, for example, the other tables that are in the same schema of this Azure SQL database table. All right, so I skipped over the lineage tab because I wanted to show this last, because this is a very cool, in my mind, capability of the governance portal. Now, like I talked about, the governance portal has been iterated on heavily since it came out. This was a much requested feature. It wasn't there at launch. But they continue to put more engineering resources into fleshing out how this works and the number of sort of data sources it supports. But let's talk through kind of what it is now in its current state, right? So the lineage tab is intended to show just that, the lineage of this particular data asset. The idea is to give sort of the upstream and downstream view of where it came from, how it was created, and what it's being used by. The idea here is you can have, dependency analysis, right? So if I want to go change the city text file that's stored in this Azure data lake, I need to know what downstream processes are using it that might be impacted, right? And so I can use the Purview governance portal to get an idea of how that might look. Also, if you are a data engineer, you're running an Azure Data Factory pipeline, and there's a failure, you might come here just to see, okay, what things are broken downstream if this pipeline didn't run correctly the night before, okay? So this is, as you can imagine, very useful information. And you can even do things like, so these are the columns, right, in the ticket payment info table here that we're looking at. I can click on the column and it will highlight within the lineage view what of the upstream data sources that were used to generate this SQL table, which one did that actual column come from, right? So in this case, city name came from the city text, and it kind of highlights that for you to make it a little easier to see. Venue name, in this case, gets added later in the process, and it comes from this venues text file, which is used to generate, which is manipulated by this Azure Data Factory copy activity, creates a venues text file, which is then fed and used downstream in the actual Azure SQL table. So that's what this is showing us here. Now, how does this work? How does this get populated and created? So first off, there are some automatic sources of lineage. So as you can imagine, the first-party Azure data services, they were the first ones to get automatically added into this. So the way it works is I can take a Synapse workspace or an Azure Data Factory that's in my Azure tenant. I can connect it into Purview, and then every time one of its pipelines runs, it'll feed the metadata from that pipeline run automatically into Purview. And now, assuming Purview has scanned the sources and the destinations of what that pipeline is working on or acting upon, that will then give it all the information it needs to create an automatic lineage map. So currently, this supports the copy activity. It supports pieces of the data flow activity in the Azure Data Factory and Synapse pipelines. There's a couple other things that are supported automatically. There is the Azure data shares included. I'm just going through this in my head now. Teradata store procedures. They've actually even added capability for SQL store procedures to be able to be used as part of this automatic lineage. So the way that works is the stored procedure, after it runs, the actual contents of what happened within that stored procedure are stored within the SQL engine itself. And Purview is able to scan that information into the lineage view to help generate lineage. So it's actually, as someone who's worked with SQL for a long time, I thought that was really cool how they implemented that. It's not actually trying to parse or use the SQL, right, that's in the store procedure. It's looking at what happened from an engine perspective and seeing what tables or views or what have you are being acted upon and using that information to generate the lineage. So that's how automatic lineage gets created, but obviously this doesn't support every way data gets created, all data processing systems. So they did just recently add the capability to create manual lineage. So you can actually use the UI to create your own source and destinations manually if you want to, as part of the data curation process. And you can even show within that process, okay, this column came from this, and the downstream table it connects into is this, right? So you can draw that all out using the GUI here. Now there is also, I should mention now, behind Purview, this entire thing is powered by the Apache Atlas API, which means everything that you see me interacting with, whether it be the data catalog, the data assets, the lineage view, all of this is something that can be modified or read from through a REST API. So there are actually programmatic ways to work with the data in Purview. And there's actually a whole bunch of GitHub repos that have, folks have created applications that use that REST API, or there's even SDKs now for some popular languages to sort of programmatically manipulate the stuff that's in the data catalog. Okay, so let me just bounce back over here. And just to show real quick, so if I were a user, this is the search experience. This is a pretty smart search. It uses some of the same techniques that Bing search uses, for example. So it will rank things based on, for example, how curated the data asset is. That'll move it up in the search results. And there's all kinds of smarts and AI that kind of go in to help surface relevant results for any of your searches. And again, you can see on the left over here, I search for country, but I have all these filters I can apply to sort of narrow down the results of my search to make sure I'm just targeting things that I want to look for. All right, so that was those capabilities are what was initially launched with Purview and then iterated upon, but there's some new stuff that's sort of a more recent addition that I'll just touch on briefly. Some of these are still in preview, but let's go through real quick a data share, right? So data share is the capability to internally or externally share data sets that you scanned into your data map with other folks, right? So the way it's implemented currently in Purview is it only works right now with Azure Data Lake or Azure Blob Storage, but it allows you to actually create a share that shares your data in place. So what does that mean? That means that if I have a file in my data lake or an entire folder, let's say, I can create a share, which will ask me as part of that process to provide an email address. It'll create a share. It'll send an email to that person saying, do you want to accept their share? And then if they do, and I pointed it to, in this case, this asset in my data lake, it will actually ask the end user who received the share where in their own data lake or blob storage account they'd like to receive that share. And essentially what happens in the back end is it creates sort of the equivalent of a pointer. And so they'll select where they want to attach the data that you shared, and then they'll get a read-only copy that shows up in their own storage account. Okay, and again, this is cross-tenant even, so this works with external entities. They do need Azure, they do need a Purview account currently to utilize this, but it will create an in-place data share that they can then access the data. They can even directly run queries against it, for example, using Synapse Spark or other tools that they have in their own Azure subscriptions to query the data and to do analytics against it, basically. So that's a pretty cool feature. Again, currently in preview, but they're already talking about expanding, what data sources can be shared and sort of the different ways you'll be able to share it, but that's kind of just what's capable now in the preview version. All right, so let's switch over to Data Estate Insights. All right, so Data Estate Insights is a reporting mechanism to sort of get a bird's eye view of everything that's in the governance portal. So your entire data estate, everything that you've scanned in, you can think of this as like a bird's eye view for the chief data officer to just sort of be able to see everything as it is, right? And so the first report is sort of just showing you, okay, how good are we as an organization at curating and updating the data as it comes into our data map? So we can see which assets have, sensitive classifications applied, which ones do we consider fully curated, and clearly we're doing a bad job here in this demo Purview account. And you can even break this out by collection. So if you want to focus in on just one department or other way you've organized those collections, you can. And you get some sort of helpful graphs and visuals just to sort of see that. You also get a catalog adoption, and this is kind of what it sounds like. This is just showing you how many users are using the data catalog you've created and sort of where that usage is trending. There is sort of an inventory view. And the inventory view is designed to just, okay, show me all of the assets in a graphical form and give me some high level information about them, right? So if I look at data assets by collection, I can see which of those collections currently owns the most data assets, right? I can even filter it by source, so I can get an idea, okay, I have a lot of my data is coming from SAP, for example, and you can sort of see that broken out here in a nice visual way. And further, we've got views of glossary, classification, sensitivity labels, and if this loads here, let's see if we can get the classifications to load. Again, this particular demo account is being heavily used, so it's sometimes a little slower than normal. But we can see, okay, the top classification categories as I've defined them, right? And you can even drill down into the individual classifications and how many assets they're being applied to, broken out by, in this case, sort of files and tables. And then we can kind of get the same information for those sensitivity labels that we described earlier, right? So top labels that are applied across our different data sources for tables and files as well. And this is another thing that they continue to add new reports here and new information. So, you know, as the service continues to get engineered, it will, you know, I'm sure add more reports and more information here. All right, let's flip over to the last thing I wanted to show you in the governance portal, which is data policy. All right, so earlier we spoke how, you know, what the service is doing is it's scanning data into the data map, and then using those collections, I can create permissions on the different collections for users to, you know, scan the actual, or be able to view the actual contents of that data catalog. Data policies is a new preview feature that goes one step further and is designed to actually give direct access to the data through Purview. So what that might look like is if I have a business analyst that's using the data catalog to find where do we store the customer table, right? I need to build a Power BI report. Maybe they'll find that in the data catalog, but then realize they don't actually have access to the customer table, so they can't use it in their report. There is at the top of the asset overview screen a request access button, okay? The request access button will kick off a workflow that will allow you to either automatically or manually grant access to that data source through Purview. So the idea here is that eventually, you know, as this gets expanded to support more and more data sources, you'll have sort of a single pane of glass source where you can not only centralize all the data in your data estate, but even grant access to it. So you'll have full permissionings in the actual data catalog itself, and then you'll have the capability to do self-service access so that users can request access. So what that currently looks like is that right now, Azure Data Lake, Azure SQL Database, and believe it or not, even SQL Server on-prem are all automatic sources that are supported by this process. And what I mean by that is that if I set it up to work like this, a user can request access to a SQL Server table on-prem, and assuming the owner, the data owner that's set in Purview, you know, when they request access, the data owner will get an email saying, hey, this person requested access through Purview. They can click yes on that screen. And Purview now has the capability to automatically go and give that access, right? So if I switch over to the workflows over here, see if I can show what one of those workflows actually look like. Come on, Purview. All right, this account's taking a little longer, but while that loads, so what's actually happening here is that it will go out, assuming you hit yes on that access email, it will actually go out. Yeah, this one failed. It'll actually go out. It will reach down through the Azure Arc system into your on-prem SQL Server in this case, and automatically grant, let's say, read permissions, if that's what you've defined to happen on that data source. And so that same concept works for currently, again, Azure SQL and the data lake. So someone can be using the data catalog to peruse the contents of your data lake, find an interesting, let's say, Delta table that you have stored there, request access to it, and it can automatically be granted to the underlying sort of folder and files through the data lake in a granular way through Purview. All right, so again, that's a new capability. That's currently in preview, and that's for the self-service access policies, right? So that's for users that are actually using the data catalog to request their own access. Purview actually also has the capability to create data policies so that you as the data owner can actually just provide blanket access, without someone having to request it, to certain users or even AD groups to those same data sources, right? So I can create a data policy rule that says any member of this Active Directory group, I want to have read access at the resource group level in Azure to any Azure SQL database, right? So I can do that through Purview so that instead of having to individually go in as the DBA and manually add, this Active Directory group to the reader role, right, in the SQL Server itself, I can actually do that at a higher level through Purview in Azure to say, okay, any databases in this entire resource group that currently exists and any new databases that get added are automatically now granted using this data policy. This user or this group is automatically granted access to them. So not only is this, creating a centralized place within Purview to manage permissioning in a way that, prior to this, you basically had to do at the individual data source level, but it's actually creating new capability in that I can use the concept of Azure subscriptions and resource groups to give folks access at higher levels, right? Instead of having to do it at the individual server level, I can do it at the entire resource group or subscription level to, make that a much easier process in an automated way, right? So as new servers in that resource group come online, the permissions are already in place. And the final thing I'll show real quick is the DevOps policies. And this is similar to the data policies. The difference here is that this is intended for DevOps folks in your organization that just need to be able to monitor a resource, whether that's security monitoring or performance monitoring. These DevOps policies are scoped permissions that just give them specific access to perform those capabilities, right? Security auditing, performance monitoring on those data sources. Okay, and so that's what the DevOps policies do. All right, so that hopefully gave you some new information that you didn't have. I know that was a lot of information. I'm sure there was questions in the chat. But as you can see, Purview, as it's grown especially, is becoming more and more a pivotal and central component to Azure and to the modern data estate. So going forward, this is definitely going to be a linchpin service for anyone using the wider Azure data platform, okay? So with that, thank you. And Adam, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brett, for walking us through that. Thank you so much, everyone, for all the amazing questions. A super interactive Q&A today, which is fantastic to see. Just want to share some resources here that are in front of you. If you have any questions about Purview, would like any assistance, you can contact that email address there, msslgcompliance@microsoft.com. There are some technical documentation links as well. And if you would like to participate in those workshops listed on the slide, please get in touch with your CSAMs and let them know. I'm also going to drop a link real quick into the Q&A area so that you can sign up for your Microsoft Purview customer community and teams if you've not already done so. And last but not least, our next webinar session is on April 13th, and we'll be discussing getting ahead of internal and external threats. More to come on that. Thank you all again so much for being here. Thank you so much for your questions, and we really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to it. We will see you next time.